Again, want to welcome everybody to our Congressional Lyme series on this day in June, entitled Lyme Disease, the First Epidemic in an Era of Climate Change. I'm Jeff Crater. I'm a co-founder and board member of the Center for Lyme Action, and I'll be your host and co-host really for the next hour and 15 minutes. I'm joined by Bonnie Crater, my sister, who is also a co-founder and board member for the Center for Lyme Action. If you have questions, and I encourage you to do that throughout the next hour and 15 minutes, you can put any questions you have in the chat. So next slide. So here I am, Jeff Crater. As I said, I'm a co-founder and board member of the Center for Lyme Action. I've worked on Capitol Hill for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I've been advisors to 2 secretaries of energy, and I've run government relations for a Fortune really 1,000 company. And I'm a parent of boy-girl twins that are now 10 who have Lyme disease. Next slide. So Center for Lyme Action, we stood up this organization in May of 2019. We're a 501c4, which gives us a broader capability to advocate and lobby for federal funding for Lyme disease, as well as prevention and research. The organization, again, started in May of 2019. We launched in October of 2019, and it was about literally 24 hours after that, we were in meeting with Senator Collins' office and working with Senator Tina Smith's office on the K-Haken Tick Act, which had about 6 co-sponsors at the time. And we moved from 6 just after the Thanksgiving period to about December 15th, when not only through our efforts, but many of you who are on this Zoom call today, we all worked together to try and get additional co-sponsors to the bill. We wound up with 33 by about December 20th. And within that same time frame, just before Christmas, the bill was signed into law. So just really a rapid advancement for at least legislatively, and giving the authorization to the Department of Health and Human Services to improve the funding at the CDC for Lyme disease prevention. So next slide. So our mission at Center for Lyme Action is to grow federal funding for Lyme disease. Next. And to help accomplish that, we hire professional lobbyists to advocate for Lyme research and prevention activities in the legislative and executive branches of our government. So I'm an example of one of those that that we have on board. We also are have been more recently joined by Meredith Fossett. Many of you have communicated with her and know her. And she's our manager of government relations. She really is the one that keeps the trains running for our organization when Bonnie and I are pulled in many different directions. So thank you, Meredith. So next slide. So our values, we're bipartisan, we're humane, inclusive, and scientific. So bipartisan, we don't care whether you're, and as Dr. Kristen Honey says, the ticks don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican, an independent, or whatever you may want to be. We all know that. It's unfortunate, but we do know that. We're humane. A lot of people have Lyme disease, and so we want to be sensitive to the needs and concerns of everyone that we work with, or unfortunately may not be feeling too well that day to work with us. We're also inclusive. We bring all points of view. Obviously, we got to sift through and lay out our priorities, but we like to hear from you. We like to hear from your opinions. We're also we're scientific. Our basis is really to grow federal funding for advanced research, for Lyme disease diagnostics, for therapies and a cure. Next slide. So we we can't do our business, we can't do our work, all of us can't do our work without the fantastic support of our key members. So our charter members of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, Alexandra Cohn, the Fairbairn family, Project Lyme, and Lori Woods. Our gold members, Phyllis and Scott Bedford, and Focus on Lyme, and dare I say, one of our great champions in this community, and everybody knows her well, Paula Jackson-Jones, who started the Mid-Coast Lyme Disease Support and Education Organization in Maine. And I also want to recognize Jill and Ira Auerbach as a supporting member as well. So we do need support, and you can go to our website, centerforlymeaction.org, and we have individual memberships for $30, and love to have you as a member. Next slide. So our agenda for today. Welcome everyone. We'll launch our first with U.S. Senator Tina Smith for some recorded remarks. She couldn't join us live today, but she has a very, very positive message that she's going to deliver via video remarks, followed by U.S. Senator Susan Collins and from Maine, and Congresswoman Anna Eshoo from California, from the Bay Area of California. Following Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, Dr. Rachel Levine. We're so fortunate to have her. She's the Assistant Secretary for Health at the Department of Health and Human Services, for her recorded remarks. And then we'll next turn to an expert panel, which will be live and moderated by Bonnie Crater. And then we will turn to a Q&A sessions. And that's where, again, I encourage you to put your questions, even as I speak now, if you have something that comes to mind that you want to ask. But you may come up with some pretty good ones once you hear the expert panel. We got a great panel. Next slide. So let me start off by introducing, and I'm so delighted to introduce, U.S. Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota, a huge supporter of Lyme disease. She was the original co-sponsor of the Key-Hagen-Tick Act. She serves on the Senate Health Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and she's also serves on the Senate Committee on Ag, Nutrition, and Forestry. So let's hear what Tina Smith has to say.
Hi, it's U.S. Senator Tina Smith here. Thank you for inviting me to join your congressional meeting today. So May was Lyme Disease Awareness Month, and in Minnesota, May is also the unofficial kickoff to lake season. So after long, cold winters, we are always excited to spend time outside, especially this time of year. Unfortunately, this means that Minnesotans are at higher risk of contracting Lyme and other tick-borne diseases. And these diseases are so pervasive, not only in Minnesota, but also lots of other states. And that's why I teamed up with Senator Susan Collins to introduce a bipartisan bill to improve research and prevention and treatment for Lyme and other tick-borne diseases. And thanks to your help, our bill, the Key-Hagen-Tick Act, was signed into law in 2019. This law is named after the late North Carolina Senator Kay Hagan, who we lost too soon from a tick-borne disease. Our law will marshal the resources of the federal government to develop a national strategy to prevent and treat Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. So I want to thank you for your important work to address this serious public health problem. I'm grateful for you, and I look forward to seeing you all in person soon.
All right, thank you, Senator Smith. She obviously recognized Senator Kay Hagan as someone who I knew personally, and just I'm very fortunate that with her untimely death following her departure from the U.S. Senate. So with that, let me introduce U.S. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, a huge champion of Lyme disease, Lyme and tick-borne disease, research, prevention, and the original co-sponsor of the Key-Hagen-Tick Act. Senator Collins serves on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, along with Tina Smith. She also serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee and has been an extraordinary leader on that committee on the issues that we care about. She is a very senior member of the Senate. She's ranked 11 among the 100 United States senators, and she prides herself having the longest perfect voting record of 7,000 plus votes. So, Senator Susan Collins.
Good afternoon. My thanks to the Center for Lyme Action for hosting this important discussion. Your work to raise awareness about Lyme disease and to advocate for increased research funding truly makes a difference. Lyme disease is the first epidemic to emerge in the era of climate change. In fact, Lyme is the fastest growing vector-borne infectious disease in the United States. It has been diagnosed in every single state. In January, the CDC reported that nearly 500,000 Americans were diagnosed with and treated for Lyme disease annually between 2010 and 2018. This new calculation is 10 times higher than the number of previously reported cases. This crisis hits close to home for me. My state of Maine has one of the highest rates of Lyme disease in the country. Climate change has brought ticks and thus tick-borne illnesses to Maine, even to the most northern reaches of our state. In the last government funding bill, with your help, we achieved a great deal. For the first time, Congress specifically targeted Lyme disease with a $10 million funding increase at the National Institutes of Health. This brought total NIH funding to pursue reliable diagnostics and better therapies to $81 million. We also provided $4 million for the Kay Hagan Tick Act that I authored. This is just a start, but an important one. I am continuing to advocate for increased funding in this year's appropriations bill. This COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated what so many of you have known for so long. Infectious diseases are a major public health threat. We must not lose momentum in investing in research, awareness, and prevention. We must also support public-private innovation to combat the devastating diseases that can be caused by tick bites. Thank you for your advocacy and keep up the great work. And a special hello to the folks from Maine.
Oh, and thank you, Senator Collins. So next, we are delighted to have Congresswoman Anna Eshoo of California deliver recorded remarks. She is an incredible leader in the House. She's chairwoman of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. She's also a member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology in the House. And she is one of the senior leaders in the House as the 19th most senior member of the U.S. House of Representatives. So delighted again to introduce and look forward to hearing her remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to address the Center for Lyme Action at your virtual Congressional Lyme series. And I want to thank my constituent and the co-founder of the center, Bonnie Crater. She is a force of nature, and she invited me to be with you today. I think it's so wonderful that you have Dr. Rachel Levine, the new HHS Secretary for Health, who is leading HHS's ambitious LymeX diagnostic moonshot. As you know so well, all of you, Lyme disease is often a debilitating disease. It can cause achy joints, foggy thinking, depression, and shaky hands. And for too many patients, an accurate diagnosis can take years. If a patient is fortunate enough to get a diagnosis, which many currently do not, treatment options are limited. For the over 300,000 Americans diagnosed each year with Lyme disease, there's still too much unknown about the causes of this tick-borne disease and the appropriate treatments for it. This is especially alarming as climate change increases the risk of Lyme disease in new geographical areas. The good news is we're making progress, and it's because of the Center for Lyme Action and your important advocacy and educational events like this today are critical to convincing Congress why we must fully fund important tick-borne disease-related programs. Your advocacy and efforts to share your personal stories are so important because no one can say you don't know what you're talking about. So thanks to your work in 2019, the Kay Hagan Tick Act was signed into law. It authorizes an unprecedented federal investments toward Lyme disease and other vector-borne diseases. Our task now, both as members of Congress and as advocates, is to make sure that these programs are fully funded. I'm proud to be part of the group, a bipartisan group of members that requested $20 million for the CDC to improve data collection and analysis of Lyme disease, and $10 million for the Regional Centers of Excellence for Vector-Borne Diseases. They are leading the way on cutting-edge research into Lyme. So you can always count on me to be your partner, to continue to be a champion for those diagnosed and living with tick-borne diseases, and I genuinely look forward to continuing our work to follow through on the promises that Congress is making so that we can really take this on full force. Thank you for including me in your important event and for your superb work. Thanks again.
Well said, Congresswoman Eshoo. You can understand why she has been in Congress for so long. Her attention to detail is extraordinary, and we so appreciate those remarks. So with that, let me introduce, very excited and delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Rachel Levine, Assistant Secretary for Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Levine comes to the Biden administration from the state of Pennsylvania, where she served under Governor Wolf, I have that right, as the former Secretary of Health in that state. So, Dr. Levine.
Welcome. I am Dr. Rachel Levine, and I am honored to serve as the 17th Assistant Secretary for Health at the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you, distinguished members of Congress, for creating space for us to highlight the importance of Lyme disease in the face of global climate change. And thank you for your continued support of this important issue. With the passage of the Kay Hagan Tick Act of 2019, we've been able to make significant progress in regards to Lyme disease. Now, Lyme disease is a topic I'm very familiar with, especially in my previous role as the Secretary of Health in Pennsylvania. Last year, we authored a health advisory for Pennsylvania due to a spike in emergency department visits resulting from tick bites during the pandemic. The growth of Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses is alarming. The CDC estimates approximately 476,000 Americans are diagnosed and treated for Lyme disease each year, by far the most common vector-borne disease in the United States, and children represent over 29% of these cases. Climate change is worsening the problem by expanding the geographic and seasonal distribution of ticks, which increases the risk of humans contracting Lyme and other tick-borne diseases, in new parts of the country, especially along the northern tier. Under President Biden, climate change is a top priority. Health equity is paramount because climate change-related health stressors, such as extreme flooding, disproportionately impact our most vulnerable communities. Climate stressors exacerbate health disparities, demonstrating how environmental health and human health are inexorably linked. My office is embracing transformative innovation, going big with the entire Biden administration to accelerate scientific breakthroughs and innovation with cross-cutting collaboration and partnerships. This includes the HHS LymeX Innovation Accelerator, or LymeX, a $25 million public-private partnership. It's the world's largest public-private partnership for Lyme disease and is putting patients first, changing the status quo. Earlier this year, the LymeX team conducted nearly 700 hours of Lyme disease discovery, including interviews and workshops with Lyme disease patients, practitioners, and policymakers, and created an HHS Health Plus human-centered design report. This 123-page human-centered design report highlights patient, caregiver, and clinician stories and describes opportunities and recommendations for a path forward. Using this report, we are planning a healthathon to raise awareness about Lyme disease and preventing tick bites. In addition, the LymeX team convened a virtual event in April 2021 called the LymeX Roundtable, Bridging the Trust Gap. We partnered with a neutral third-party organization, the Center for Open Data Enterprise, to lead the roundtable and to synthesize its report. I am pleased to announce today's publication of the LymeX Roundtable Summary Report, where you can read highlights and outcomes from our April roundtable. This framework is the scaffolding for a very ambitious national strategy for vector-borne diseases, guided by the Kay-Hagan Tick Act of 2019. My office is also leading efforts to develop the first national strategy on vector-borne diseases, which we are on schedule to present to Congress in 2023. The LymeX partnership is advancing the National Public Health Framework for the prevention and control of vector-borne diseases in humans, which was an interagency effort and published by the CDC in 2020, with goals and strategic priorities for HHS and other federal agencies. We will continue to build on our LymeX partnership, given its track record for success. While we tackle the big picture, we want to ensure that children are not left behind in this equation. We look forward to working with you on all of these important issues. Complex challenges like Lyme disease are too big and complex for any one entity or one discipline to solve. Our success with LymeX and transforming today's Lyme disease status quo together will be driven by the power of the crowd and your collective action. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Levine. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Bonnie Prater. She's the co-founder and board member of the Center for Lyme Action, as well as a co-founder and co-chair of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation and the CEO of Full Circle Insights, which is a software-based company in Silicon Valley. And as Congresswoman Anna Eshoo says, she's our force of nature. So Bonnie.
All right, well, I'm not sure I'm a force of nature, but I'll give it a go. The people that are actually the forces of nature are the people on our expert panel. And I'm really pleased I don't know all of them super well, but the ones I do know well are totally awesome. And I'm getting to know the other ones on our panel. And it's really a pleasure to be with these amazing people. So I hope you enjoy their comments. And while I'm doing this, I'm gonna ask Jeff to, he's on mute right now, but I'm gonna ask him to kind of look through your questions and see what's there, so that once we're through the expert panel part, he can tee up some of your questions. Okay,
yeah, just use the Q&A function for questions. There's a lot of chat, and we will record those conversations that are in the chat, so we can answer questions perhaps after the session for many of you that want to communicate afterwards. Sorry, Bonnie.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's a good interruption. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the panel, each individual. So there's 4 on the panel. One of our panelists is Dr. Charlotte Mao, and Charlotte is, of course, a Lyme physician, and she may actually be helping some patients. Nope, she made it. Yay, yay, Charlotte. Woohoo. Okay, good job. All right. All right, so here, let's get started here. Sorry, I'm adjusting a few things on my screen. The first person I'd like to introduce is Mary Beth Pfeiffer. So some of you may know her. I've read her book. Have you read her book yet? It's called Lyme, the First Epidemic of Climate Change. And this book is great. I was reading it again, actually, on the plane. And I was reading it this time kind of in a disorganized way. I kind of opened it up and I would read like a great story, and then I'd open it up to another section, read another great story. Anyway, it's a very accessibly written book. And also, Mary Beth was very kind in letting me borrow the title for this event, which is quite similar to the title of her book. So she was very kind in letting me do some borrowing there. So thank you, Mary Beth. So, okay, so that's our first panelist. Our next panelist is Dr. Kristen Honey. And Dr. Honey is the Chief Data Scientist and Executive Director for InnovationX, right inside the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Honey is the leader of the LymeX program. So hopefully in her remarks, she'll talk a little bit about that. Dr. Levine also talked about LymeX, and it was very exciting to me to hear that Dr. Levine is going to continue to invest in LymeX, which is really good. Good job. Okay. Next up, we'll have Dr. Charlotte Mao, and Charlotte is an expert at infectious disease for children. She is part of the Harvard system, Massachusetts General Hospital, as well as the Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital. And particularly, she works at the Dean Center for Tickborne Illness. Dr. Mao is an outstanding physician who's also heavily studied in public health. She has an MPH as well. So very excited to have Dr. Mao with us as well. And lastly, we have Dr. Mikki Paul. Mikki is part of the Stanford University School of Medicine. She's an instructor there, but she's been studying Lyme disease, and particularly the impact of Lyme disease. Excuse me, I'm coughing here. Sorry. Excuse me. Okay, and particularly the impact of Lyme disease on the immune system. I think, as far as I know, I think Mikki might be one of the experts in the world on Lyme disease and the immune system. And you see her on video here. She's got, maybe she'll tell us what that cell is behind her head when she does her remarks. There you go. That's a macrophage. The macrophage are the Pac-Man cells inside your immune system that eat all the bad bacteria. It's great. Okay, so she'll tell you all about that. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to start with Mary Beth, and each of our panelists is going to make 2 to 3 minutes of remarks to introduce themselves and to kind of kick off our panel. So I'm going to start back with Mary Beth, the author of Lyme, the first epidemic of climate change. And Mary Beth, take it away.
Thanks much. It's good to be here. Just a little bit about me first, to tell you how I got to the topic of Lyme disease, and in particular a book on it. I was an investigative reporter for about 30 years, reporting in an area of the country, the Hudson Valley of New York, with among the highest Lyme disease rates, I later learned, in the world. I knew about Lyme disease, and as an investigative reporter, I thought I would kick back a little bit and, from the stories on corruption and, prison suicides among the mentally ill and, tragedies and wasted government money and so forth. And I just sort of, do a look-see at Lyme disease. What was there? What was there to be found? So I start looking at the numbers. I expect to see the numbers going up. And of course, I do see the numbers going up. But then I start to interview patients. I start to interview doctors, health officials. But in particular, it was the patients that grabbed me. 10 to 15 doctors I went to try and get a diagnosis for Lyme disease. I emptied my bank account trying to get treatment. I was told I had anxiety, I was depressed, I had rheumatoid arthritis, I had fibromyalgia, anything but Lyme disease, which was the underlying problem in most of these cases. But I also found beyond that, that the focus among the powers that be wasn't really these patients and their continuing health problems, but the doctors who were treating them outside of these very firmly defined parameters for how we're supposed to treat Lyme disease. And those guidelines basically say that the test for Lyme disease works. It can tell you whether you are infected or not. And the treatments for Lyme disease, short courses of antibiotics, work. Well, this is not exactly what I found in in interviewing people who had had Lyme disease, in talking to their doctors, who, by the way, were often the subject of inquiries by state licensing boards because they were trying to help their patients. So, long story short, I did not expect to find a scandal in Lyme disease. I did not expect to find an investigative story, but that's exactly what I found. And what I anticipated being one or two quick turnaround stories became a very long series of articles. And more than that, what really kept me going is, here I am working at a small newspaper, 30,000 circulation in the Hudson Valley, and I start getting emails from all over the country and many other countries of the world. The last thing I'd say before I'll turn it over is that there was a disconnect between that firmly defined picture of Lyme disease and what these people were experiencing. But even among the mainstream practitioners who were upholding those guidelines, there was an acknowledgement that 10 to 20% of people who suffer from Lyme disease stay sick for some amount of time after their initial bout. One study has 5% of people suffering 15 years later. This amounts to literally hundreds of thousands of people by this point, going back to when Lyme disease began, I guess around the early 90s. So we have a lot of work to do on Lyme disease. We haven't solved many of the major problems of diagnosis, of treatment. We need the research. We need to move forward on Lyme disease. And we'll get to climate change and talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks so much, Mary Beth. Okay, next on our list of speakers, and I'll ask Kristen Honey to take herself off mute because I can't seem to do it for you, Kristen. There you go. Dr. Kristen Honey is our Lyme champion inside of HHS. And we are honored to have her here. And Kristen, why don't you take it away?
Sure, thanks so much for creating this event and opportunity to speak. So I'll just kind of intro myself. Kristen Honey, originally from Portland, Maine, in the islands off the coast of Portland, where I was bitten by ticks in 1999. And little did I know it, my life would never be the same. I graduated from Stanford undergrad, went from public schools in Maine all the way across country, and then worked for about 10 years before going back to grad school and becoming a scientist. Did a master's at UC Santa Cruz, and then was doing my PhD at Stanford. Went back to Stanford in this interdisciplinary biology program, the EMIT interdisciplinary program for the environment and resources. And I completely collapsed. And this was around 2009, a decade after my initial tick bites. And, you know, all symptoms, never knew they were connected. Everything from Raynaud's autoimmunity to insomnia to adult onset ADHD, adult onset acne, like toe fungus that defied treatment, all these weird symptoms that I never knew when I got treated for Lyme would resolve or largely resolve. And so in 2009, it took me 6 months to figure out what was going on. I was really, really, really sick, too sick to care or advocate for myself. Finally at Stanford, they diagnosed me as having Lyme disease. And my first thought was, great, that's a bacterial infection. Give me some antibiotics and I'll be on my way. And little did I know that it was going to be another 2.5 years of nothing but full-time healing before I would be healthy enough to work again. So my life took a huge detour. As Nicole Malikowski and I like to say, we were recruited by ticks, and never imagined that I would end up in this space as a scientist. But because of my science connections, people believed in me that I wasn't faking it. And I was actually able to navigate to cutting edge treatments and find my way out, but it took everything in my life. You know, relationships destroyed, financial security destroyed, career starting over. Ultimately, I was able to finish my PhD, but it was a 2.5-year detour. And when I came back, I ended up going, I was always a scientist who wanted to have science serving society, science to make an impact and make things better, not just academic publications, and came to DC in 2013. And a lot of my DC portfolio was actually climate change and water energy nexus modeling, systems modeling, pretty quantitative. And then I ended up getting an opportunity to work in the Obama White House and served in the Obama White House leading open data and my data interoperability. I was lucky that that had really bipartisan support. So I was able to stay on as a policy advisor and move the entire portfolio of open data and data interoperability over to the White House Office of Management Budget, where we baked it into how government is run today. And now it's law called the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. And the idea is that any information about government or that federally funded science pays for, like taxpayers pay for, should be freely available and easily discoverable to all of you because you help pay for it. So you can go to data.gov, and this open data fuels scientific discoveries, accelerates breakthroughs, fuels innovation because everyone has access to it. It's not locked behind government or ivory tower walls. So I did that for about 3 years total, 1.5 years in the Obama administration, 1.5 years in the Trump administration. So I had my Lyme survivor hat and I had my science hat. And then I also was at this point a policy expert. And I came over to HHS in 2018. And it was really all about problem solving complex, wicked challenges, as I call them. And Lyme is definitely a wicked challenge where you need different disciplines to come together. No one group alone can solve it. If they could, we would not be in the mess we're in today. And so the first thing we really did was listen to the community and what's needed. And there was a bottom-up movement, a groundswell of years from all of you, many of you watching today in the trenches, demanding Lyme innovation, demanding Lyme action. And that manifested in a series of workshops, a bunch of hackathons all across the country, from Harvard and Tufts and MIT to Berkeley and Stanford. And these civic tech movements led led government to lean into it and said, okay, the community is saying there's a problem here. They're saying we're slow to act. And in the absence of federal government leadership, they were stepping up and leading the way. So in 2018, HHS launched its Lyme Innovation Initiative and connect those bottom-up movements with top-down. And our belief is that transformative impact and change happens when the passion and the insights and the knowledge on the front lines from the bottom up meets top-down resources and priority and the levers we can pull in government. And so we're in a really exciting moment in time right now. And I toggle between several different hats. One of them is a Lyme survivor with a functional cure. I still live with the repercussions of having had Lyme disease misdiagnosed for a decade. Also as a scientist, credentials, Stanford Ph.D., and also as a policy advisor and policy expert who served in the White House. And with all those tools, I'm really hoping our next challenge we can solve is with Lyme disease.
Oh, thank you so much, Kristen. That was awesome. Next up, I'm going to introduce Dr. Charlotte Mao. And Dr. Mao, you are on mute right now. So I'm going to ask you to unmute. And can you make some introductory remarks for us, Charlotte?
Hi, first of all, I thank the Center for Lyme Action for hosting this important forum, and I'm honored to be a part of this panel. I am a pediatric infectious disease physician in the Boston area who's based at Massachusetts General Hospital. I practice in the pediatric clinic of the Dean Center for Tickborne Illness at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital. This is a multidisciplinary clinic for children with complex Lyme disease and associated infections. We opened a year ago, last summer, for clinical care and plan to also do clinical research studies on pediatric Lyme disease. I got interested in Lyme disease maybe 7 to 8 years ago when I made a shift in my career from focusing on pediatric HIV clinical care and research. And I started at that time to also see patients in an outpatient general infectious disease referral clinic at Boston Children's Hospital, where I previously worked. And in that clinic, Lyme disease was the single most common reason for referral of the patients I saw, who mostly were referred by their general pediatricians. And over a couple of years of seeing a very large number of Lyme patients, listening to their stories of confusing symptoms on a complicated journey to get to a diagnosis, and then diving deeply into the scientific and medical literature on Lyme disease, I gradually developed a much different view of Lyme disease from where I started. And I learned that the reality of Lyme disease and associated conditions is vastly more complex and nuanced than I had ever learned in my medical training. It essentially led me to change the focus of my career as I grew to realize there are gaping unmet needs requiring, I believe, a paradigm shift in this field, in both the clinical care and the diagnosis of Lyme patients, as well as the need for high quality translational and clinical research that's grounded in what is known about Lyme disease from basic science studies. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing so much great work with the kids and other patients that have Lyme disease. Next up, I have Mikki Tall, and Mikki is a research scientist at Stanford. And Mikki, I'm going to ask you to come off mute and make a few opening remarks. Thanks, Mikki.
Hello, everybody. So I am an instructor at Stanford University, and I also did my postdoctoral research there in Irv Weissman's lab. And I am an immunologist, and I started my postdoctoral research looking at these interactions between bacteria and viruses that get into our body and our immune cells and our immune system and how these interact. And of course, the goal of the pathogen that's getting in is to replicate and exist and get out and expand and replicate in others, and to go about its life cycle. And our goal and our immune system is to try to minimize this as much as possible, minimize damage to the body, and clear these infections when possible. And I was looking at a very particular interaction between these pathogens and the immune system, and a way that pathogens have usurped our own form of communication with our immune system, where all of our cells are given the ability to say, I'm fine, everything's normal here, don't eat me, leave me alone. Immune cells just keep passing by. And some pathogens along the way have, pathogens always, they find a way to, if they're managing to exist in the body, they've found a way to mess with our immune responses. And so I was surveying different pathogens and how they were able to mimic or use our own don't eat me signal. And I came across Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, came up in this screen of mine. And I became really deeply fascinated with this bacteria. It's incredibly tricky, incredibly complicated, and it's got these programs for surviving in a tick and for surviving in a mammal, which are very different programs, very different body types that it needs to survive in. So it's a complex bug in and of itself, but also the way in which it interacts with different mammalian immune systems fascinated me as a scientist. But what really kind of hooked me in and has kept me working in Lyme beyond just that screen has been the public health problems that surround this disease. And, you know, I think that there's a lot here that we have yet to understand, but need to understand. And I think that in today's moment in time, with, you know, coronavirus pandemic happening around us and us watching long COVID just kind of happen before our eyes for so many people that had coronavirus, I think there's so many parallels for us to learn about Lyme and who does and does not recover, and look at that in the context of our evolving understanding of the complications of infectious disease and the complexities in there that we really just don't yet understand well enough. And I think that we're at this moment where we have the science, where we can really dive in and look at this with higher resolution, look at more features, more data, and really start to break down what we're seeing. So what you're seeing behind me is, you know, when you start to look at this with higher resolution microscopy, and you can really examine the interactions just from the green and pink you see in this macrophage behind me, this immune cell that's like a vacuum cleaner eating up all of this stuff that it finds. Here it's eating what you are seeing in yellow. That's the moment of eating this bacteria that causes Lyme disease. And so there's so much we're learning from how to train our macrophages, your macrophages, and also just looking at these immune interactions with the pathogens. And the last piece that I would add that I feel really passionate about as a woman in science is that this is a disease where there are really important differences between males and females and how they are responding. And I think it's really important that we look at that. It's important that we break down the data in a way that we can really try to understand these differences and address for both sexes what's going to be the best possible way to recover from this disease.
Thanks, Mikki. I love hearing you talk because I love science myself, and it's fun to continue learning from you. Okay, so we thank you, panelists. What we're going to do is we have a few questions, and then at some point Jeff's going to interrupt me and say, I have a question from so-and-so, and so on. So okay, so we'll start off with my first question, which goes back to the title of this session, which is about whether Lyme disease is an epidemic or not. So we called the session, you know, the Lyme disease the first epidemic in an era of climate change. So my question, and I think I'm going to start off with Mary Beth. Are you okay with that, Mary Beth? You're on mute right now.
I'm good with that.
Okay, good. So is Lyme disease an epidemic? Is the question? Oh, why or why not?
Well, I definitely call it an epidemic, and I call it the first epidemic of climate change, perhaps even pandemic, because it is worldwide. It's in many, many countries. In the strictest scientific sense, we would call it an endemic, which doesn't have nearly as sexy the panache as epidemic, doesn't evoke those emotions that writers like to evoke. But It's an epidemic in the sense that it is growing. It is so prevalent. It is so damaging and harmful to many people. The difference, though, and the key difference between epidemic and endemic in that strict sense is that were it a, strictly speaking, epidemic, we might see the numbers go up and then eventually we'd see the numbers go down. That's the general curve that you see as people develop immunity and treatments kick in and so forth. An endemic, on the other hand, is something that's here to stay. And tick-borne illnesses are going anything but down. It's entrenched in our environment now. Ticks are not leaving. If anything, they are moving into greater areas of the world, of the country. And beyond that, they're carrying more pathogens as well. So this is it's a serious epidemic, but it's also an endemic.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? And if not, I'll move to the next question.
Yeah, just plus one, everything Mary Beth said. She did a great job explaining, endemic. And, that's the term we use at HHS. But no matter what we call it, everyone agrees that this is a huge problem and the trends are going in the wrong direction and it demands action now. So thanks for explaining it so clearly, Mary Beth.
Awesome. Okay, next question is, how does climate change affect the spread and the risks of Lyme disease? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I'll jump in here as an interdisciplinary ecologist. So, climate change is affecting Lyme from multiple angles. Probably the most kind of obvious link is that as temperatures warm and humidity in many places increases, that's good for ticks moving north and increasing their range expansion. So places that previously were considered too cold for ticks are now experiencing it. That's not the only factor though. There are many other factors beyond climate change that are driving increased Lyme disease and more ticks. And many of them are in our control more directly. So like habitat fragmentation, moving into suburbia, killing all the apex predators where there used to be cougars and wolves and things to keep the small mammals and mice, squirrels, chipmunks, their populations in check. As nature kind of gets out of balance, that can be a real opportunity for diseases to boom. And Lyme has just been one that's benefited. The other way that climate change really touches on Lyme disease, Dr. Levine, my boss, brought up today, and that's on health equity and the disparities in climate change. So when you have climate-related problem, it can be from flooding, like Dr. Levine mentioned. It can be extreme heat, like we're seeing in New England right now, or extreme drought, like we're seeing on the West Coast. Those communities and people who have the least resources are unable to move or adapt. They may not have money for air conditioning or moving expenses or whatever it takes to get to drier, more habitable land. And that means when people are stressed, their bodies, their immune system doesn't work as well. So there can be opportunistic infections. If it's extreme flooding, like Dr. Levine mentioned, and you can't move out of those flooded houses or whatever, mold and other problems can grow. When your immune system is constantly under attack from poor living environments, that cascades, and again, opportunistic infections, and Lyme, could be one of them, come out. So the real disparities that climate change can and does exacerbate are the same disparities that we're seeing with Lyme disease, where those who don't have the financial means to move and remediate or pay for our own treatments often don't have as good as health outcomes than those who do.
Bonnie, if I could just add something quickly here. Beyond the needs to develop, a better test and diagnostics and so forth, we also have to recognize the role of climate change in this picture. And far too little attention has been paid to that enormous elephant in the room that is threatening to bring down our planet. We had, as Kristen said, a huge heat wave In Colorado, they've been struggling with record high temperatures. Somebody analyzed 149 news reports, 6 of which even bothered to mention the role of climate change. So I'm glad to hear that it's on the agenda for the Biden administration. We really need to move forward on that.
Awesome. Yeah, obviously I couldn't agree more. I have kind of a news question. This might go back to you, Mary Beth, or someone else might have some comments on this. But why is Lyme disease only seem to be addressed by the news media as a seasonal health advisory? I've observed, of course, that there's a lot of stories that come out about Lyme disease in the May, June timeframe. Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
To me, the media coverage of Lyme disease is a huge failure on many levels. And the reason that we get a lot of coverage of, it's tick season again, is because it's an easy story. The media hasn't done the hard reporting on Lyme disease. It hasn't looked into the stories of these people who stay sick, reports of tests failing. The media, and to answer your question more directly, just really follows the mainstream dogma, in this case, of Lyme disease. And the dogma, more or less, has been set by the Infectious Diseases Society of America. They put out the guidelines. They say Lyme disease is relatively easy to diagnose and to treat. And they don't question that. So they do the easy story. They know when ticks are coming out, they're getting reports, but do they scratch the surface? Do they go any deeper? No, unfortunately, that's a big problem.
Well, as a follow-on, I wanted to ask Kristen, so there's Health Plus reports, there's a bunch of new reports that Dr. Levine mentioned, where you are starting to, the government is starting to interview Lyme patients to understand the problem better. You're on mute, Kristen. Do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And I did put the reports, their links in the chat. So we have several of them.
Oh, thank you.
The Health Plus one is human-centered design. And what that means is you go out there in the community and you talk to people and try to understand what the needs are. What are the problems, in their own words, that they think are highest priority and need most attention and they want government to address. So we wanted to take that approach with Lyme disease. It's used in many other areas, but it had not been used in tick-borne infections. And part of that was because there are two, there are different, ideas or frameworks around Lyme disease. And we wanted to bridge the gap between the patient experience and then, what's in the peer-reviewed literature. And what better way, how can we possibly start if we don't know where patients are and where they're starting? So this whole human-centered design report was going out there and interviewing patients, having workshops, having listening sessions. We did a roundtable and with over around 700 hours of discussions. Out of that rolled up hundreds and hundreds of anecdotes into what we call personas or archetypes. So they're common journeys. So you're taking all what previously is often dismissed by scientists because, oh, it's just one anecdote, it's just one story. It's not real data, it's not real science. So we rolled all of that up into common experiences that we called archetypes, and there were 4 of them. And then we mapped out what are the common pitfalls or experiences of these different kind of Lyme patients or Lyme experiences. And then from those, we call them journey maps, we then were able to layer on where are the points of influence or the levers that we in federal government can move. So you have the common archetypes that are no longer anecdotes, but they're rolled up across dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. And then that points to what are the common journeys. And then over that overlay, where are the levers that we in government, where I sit in HHS, can move. So that's where we're starting. And the whole point of this report was not to tell people, what the reality of Lyme is. Rather, it was to listen. And then from that listening, package up what we heard. And then that report is a starting point for us in government to begin to have conversations of how do we bridge these divides and all. So that's one report. And we call it Health Plus. Health and then the plus sign, and that's human-centered design. If you scroll back to the chat, you'll see the link. Another report that was just published today is a report that details a roundtable that we did as part of the human-centered design approach. And that also was put in the chat. It's called the LymeX Roundtable Summary Report. And that is about moving the needle and how can we accelerate progress in patient-driven innovation, so like LymeX, but not limited to LymeX, and patient-driven research. Because more and more information is coming out that when you engage patients and caregivers and those who have lived experiences on the front lines, when you engage people early in scientific research design, you actually can come up with better study designs that save time. And in the medical world, time saved means more drugs or interventions getting to market faster, which can mean lives saved and dollars saved. So how can we engage patients into the process as true partners? So that report was just published today, the LymeX Roundtable Summary Report. And again, both of these reports are a starting point, and it's the beginning of our efforts, which will be a multi-year process of trying to bridge the worlds of what patients are experiencing today and what we see in the peer-reviewed literature, and trying to understand the science, which, as Mikki and others said, is super complex, super nuanced. We have so much to learn in this space.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen, for talking about those reports. So Kristen put them in the chat, and when we do a follow-up to everyone who attended, we'll also put those links in the follow-up email, as well as the recording of this event, so you could share it with friends and family. I want to bring Dr. bring Charlotte into this discussion. And one of the things we talked about on our prep call was about physician education. And the challenge, of course, is for a lot of Lyme patients, they often go to many doctors before getting a diagnosis. You mentioned this yourself. And I wanted to ask you about, Charlotte, about physician education and what your thoughts are on that, what we can do better. We don't have great tools with our current diagnostics and therapies, but we're doing the best that we can right now. But what can we do about physician education to improve the situation? So I'm going to ask you to come off mute before you begin, because then we won't be able to hear you if you're not off. There you go. Good.
So in terms of physician education on Lyme disease and associated infections, I would say there is far too little of it, and what does exist has major gaps that do not reflect the reality of the wide scope of how, one, patients can present. What is Lyme disease? We as physicians are not taught to recognize the extensive breadth of possible presentations of Lyme disease, nor to really understand Lyme diagnostics in all their complexity and their limitations and nuances. We aren't taught that in untreated disease or treated disease with persistent symptoms, Lyme disease is by its very nature commonly a relapsing, remitting illness with symptoms that come and go, they wax and wane. And this is a very different model of infectious disease than what most doctors are used to. So it's not surprising that many cases go missed and misdiagnosed for months to years. And that problem of misdiagnosis is compounded by the fact that really early diagnosis and treatment is your best bet for a successful treatment outcome and avoiding the development of persistent symptoms of Lyme disease. While these complex and exceedingly more varied manifestations of Lyme disease aren't generally described in standardly used frameworks, they are abundantly described in really a large, very large volume of published case reports, case series, conference reports, and select review articles. And Lyme disease has been aptly described as the new great imitator, as it can look like so many other diseases. And that title isn't surprising when you realize that the original great imitator was syphilis, which, like Lyme, is a spirochete, a spiral-shaped bacteria that presents in early and late stages, and it can include prominent neurologic or predominantly psychiatric presentations with late disease. The psychiatric presentations are just one example of a broad category of Lyme disease manifestations where there's a woeful lack of physician education. In fact, the latest version of the IDSA guidelines, Infectious Disease Society of America guidelines, specifically recommend against routine testing for Lyme disease in adults or children with psychiatric illness. And so there's little recognition on the part of physicians that that can be one of the major, that neuropsychiatric manifestations can be a major part of Lyme disease. So it's really going to be, it's going to take getting medical schools on board with changing how doctors are educated and residency training programs as well.
Yeah, it's a complex change that hopefully will happen over time, especially as we get new tools and techniques to actually battle the disease. One of the things that y'all have mentioned is IDSA, right? The Infectious Disease Society of America. And one of the things that drives a lot of Lyme patients crazy is when there's factual or information that is factually untrue published on websites. Okay, so today there was a change to the IDSA website that I read in a press release. There was a document called the Top 10 Questions About Lyme Disease that was on the IDSA website, and which was removed. This was there's been a number of people, groups working on this. There's a group called Mothers Against Lyme, which many of you in our audience may be familiar with. Holly Ahern, Christina Bauer, Jane Mark, Dr. Jane Mark, Isabel Rose, who's the chair of that group, Monica White, Dr. Wilson, and Bruce Fries is an advisor to the group, as well as Sue Faber, who's actually from Canada, not from the United States. All these people have been working on this issue. The document actually said that you can only get Lyme disease from a tick bite, which many of us have observed as lay people, that there are cases where families, mothers and children have Lyme disease. And so I wanted to ask, and I'll start with you, Charlotte, about Lyme disease. Can Lyme be passed from a mother to a child?
Yes, absolutely. But unfortunately, this is an area that's vastly understudied. There have been well-documented cases of mother-to-child transmission of Lyme disease with adverse fetal outcomes. They were identified as early as the mid-1980s in case reports and then case series. Despite this, there have been few research studies, surprisingly few studies, looking at mother-to-child transmission of Lyme, and in particular, no published prospective long-term follow-up studies of infants born to moms with Lyme disease. So as a result, we're more than 35 years after the first published report of maternal fetal transmission of Borrelia burgdorferi, the organism of Lyme disease, and we still don't know how commonly this alternate mode of transmission occurs and what are the health impacts for the vertically infected child, nor do we have consensus guidelines for diagnosis and management of Lyme disease in pregnant women or their infants. The 2020 Tick-borne disease working group in its recommendations to Congress identified the need for further evaluation of maternal fetal transmission of Lyme, including studies of its incidence, and I'll quote here, of persistent Lyme disease in undiagnosed and untreated infants resulting from maternal transmission of Borrelia burgdorferi. I'll point out that with some other infections that can be passed mother to child, for example, congenital syphilis, another spirochetal infection like Lyme disease, or perinatally acquired HIV, it was through careful observation and long-term follow-up, prospective follow-up studies that we learned these infections commonly do not present in early infancy. In HIV, the majority of cases of maternal fetal transmission actually present months to years later. Could this be the case for Lyme disease? I and many others in the field believe yes, it could, and it's certainly an area that urgently calls for further research. I'll just mention also, I don't mean to be batting on the IDSA guidelines, and I'm in fact a member of the IDSA, but I want to point out that I actually looked at the guidelines shortly before writing up my comments for this panel, and it actually says in the guidelines that to date, Lyme disease in pregnancy has not been found to result in congenital infection or a syndrome of congenital abnormalities. That's true that there is no defined syndrome of congenital abnormalities, but it is, I'm mystified as to why it says that has not been found to result in congenital infection, because there are well-documented cases in the literature and they don't cite any references for that statement. So, you know, there's a problem when most doctors are getting what they learn from these consensus diagnostic treatment guidelines that they trust.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, if you know a lot of Lyme patients like I do, you observe that there are mothers and their children who have Lyme disease, and it does not appear to be caused by an environment issue. Okay, I promised that we would end this call at 4:15, and I've been enjoying your comments very much. I wanted to give Mikki the last word here. I have a question for you, Mikki. So what are some of the kind of the interesting things that we're learning about Lyme disease, the Lyme bacteria, and how our bodies are able to or not able to clear this disease?
So I think of the most interesting things that we're learning as we start to look with higher resolution tools is that as we look at this group of people who are not recovering with antibiotics, with a standard course of antibiotics, we're seeing that we're looking at a very heterogeneous group of people. So we're looking at people who fall into different subsets. And so I think one of the big problems has been is trying to fit everybody into a same bucket and say, is this autoimmune? Is this the bacteria still there? Is that there are likely multiple different things going on? And I think as we develop better diagnostics, which I think is absolutely key, so that we really understand what's going on and who falls into which bucket, I think we're really going to be able to move from there into slightly more personalized treatment strategies in terms of how to recover based on what is actually causing the root source of the problem. And so I think that's where the most exciting research is happening, in really looking at this in much more detail so that we can understand who falls into which group.
Yeah, thank you, Mikki. Yes, this is a very complex subject. In terms, if you're a scientist, it's a very exciting area. So any budding scientists out there on the call, if you're interested in working on a really interesting area, study Lyme disease and this bacteria. I'm going to call it there. I wanted to just thank all of our panelists and for joining us the call. Thanks to all of the Congress people, particularly also Dr. Levine, our new Ash, for joining us as our keynote speaker. Thanks to Jeff, thanks to Meredith for helping us organize everything. I want to call your attention to our vision at Center for Lyme Action. Our vision is that we cure Lyme disease by 2030. And we created a paper called the Lyme Moonshot. So if you're interested in learning more about these policies and how we may be able to influence the federal government to pursue a great diagnostics and a cure of Lyme by 2030, please feel free to go to lymemoonshot.org and read that paper. These are the links that Kristen provided in the chat, which we'll also send out after, of the various reports that have been being produced by HHS. This is historic, guys. This has never happened. We are so excited to have folks inside our Department of Health and Human Services who care about Lyme patients and are starting to study this and study the disease and how patients are being affected by Lyme. With that, I just want to thank all of you for joining our Center for Lyme Action event today. We look forward to getting together in the future. This event is recorded. We will be sending out a link as a follow-up. I'm also, one of us will be cutting and pasting all of the comments and questions, and we will work on those as well as part of our follow-up to the event. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.